Welcome, everybody. I'm Dave Ferguson, Dean of the College, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural event that memorializes one of our students, Ethan Whitehead, who passed away unexpectedly in November of 2021. I want to also acknowledge that not only are his family and friends here represented, but also President and Mrs. Mearns, Provost Rivera Mills. We welcome you joining us today, and thank you. So his family has generously stepped forward to sponsor this event in acknowledgement of Ethan's passion for sustainability issues in design. His parents, Doug and Julie, are with us, and Julie would like to say a few words. I'm going to let her step to the podium for a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Dean Ferguson. So, as he mentioned, I am Julie Whitehead, and I am Ethan Whitehead's mom. I can't thank each of you enough for attending today. This is a very special day for us. I do have to thank a few people publicly. First, I have to thank your dean, Dave Ferguson. When Doug and I knew we wanted to give something in Ethan's memory, it was one of those where we were kind of like, okay, here you go, Dave, what do we do? And it was so beautiful to think that the dean of the Ball State Architecture School knew our son well enough to say it should be something on sustainability. He knows, those of you who are students here, better be careful, he knows you. That could be a good thing, or just saying. Secondly, I have to thank my husband, Doug, and my son, Nate, Ethan's brother, because they were in total support of this whole gift to the university. I also have to thank Landa Bagley, who one afternoon listened to me ramble on for a good 3 hours about my son, Ethan, and then turned around and wrote an article in the Ball State blog. I'm grateful to Ethan's longtime friends who are here. They have been of great support. I also have to thank Ethan's short-term friends, Alec and Josh and Emma, who came to our rescue shortly after Ethan died by finishing his project. I told you that day, and I'll never forget. I will never be able to pay you back. Lastly, I do have to thank Dr. Billy Fleming for coming. I'm sure right now he's thinking, what have I done? But I'm grateful to you, sir. I think about Ethan Whitehead every day, not gonna lie. But as I thought about it in relationship to this lecture, I have a few things that I'm gonna make you listen to. Ethan was not your typical architecture student. He was not. It's okay, yes. He just wasn't. But boy, did he want it bad. And he fought for it until he could be a part of this amazing group of all of you. Ethan loved history, and he loved looking at architectural history. And he wanted to use that in his work in the future. Ethan loved science. And I think that is what led him for his love and his interest in sustainability. Ethan loved his friends. And pretty much, if Ethan spent more than 5 minutes with you and you were kind to him, you were his friend. He would introduce you as, and this is my friend, blah, blah, blah. Or when he would talk about you at our house, he would say, I was talking with my friend, blah, blah, blah. And maybe you really didn't even know you were a friend. Congratulations. But I will tell you, as his friend, you were a lucky person because he would have done anything for you. Last but not least, Ethan loved Ball State University. He loved everything about it and absorbed as many opportunities as he could, including the bus system. That's right. He became a huge fan of the bus system, probably because he was a terrible driver. But that's okay. one of his last nights on campus, Saturday night, I remember he called me and said he had gone to listen to a famous jazz trombonist who was performing at your university. And he was so excited. So all of you who are students, appreciate where you are going to college and what CAP is. CAP students specifically, you are a fortunate group to be a part of BSU CAP. Don't ever be ashamed of it, and don't ever forget that you are a special group of people. If there are any prospective employers out in this audience, I need you to understand that these are very, very special young people who have learned through the guidance of Dave Ferguson about emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is the next level that we all need to learn, and Ball State University is making sure that they know that. I hope that all of you understand the great future that you have here by being a part of Ball State. I've had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Fleming, and he is as kind and giving as all of you have been to us. I will never be able to repay you. Please accept this lecture series as our family's thank you gift to each one of you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Doug, and Nathan, and the rest of you for being with us today and for those kind remarks. So I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Billy Fleming, to you tonight. Dr. Fleming is the Wilks Family Director of the McHarg Center in the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. I find it incredibly appropriate that our committee, with a lot of help from Malcolm Carnes, who really initiated the search for this inaugural speaker, recommended Dr. Fleming in his current role with the McHarg Center for the reason that Ian McHarg was a dear personal friend of mine and my family's and many of those who are here, and a friend of this college, having visited here multiple times. To me, he was one of the true environmental heroes of the last century. His seminal book, Design with Nature, is a classic for all of our fields in the environmental design arena. And students, if you have not, and this is a book that was written sometime back, and yes, it's on paper, but if you have not read Design with Nature, go check it out or find it somewhere, order it, because it still stands up after a number of decades, and I think it will for time to come. Dr. Fleming has had a significant impact in his own career. In addition to his role at the McHarg Center, he's a senior fellow with Data for Progress, co-director of the Climate Plus Community Project. He's also co-editor of A Blueprint for Coastal Adaptation, Uniting Design, Economics, and Policy, a book that just came out, and by the way, we'll be giving away some of those at the end of this talk. He's a co-curator of the book and international traveling exhibit Design with Nature Now, the author of Drowning America, The Nature and Politics of Adaptation. Prior to joining Penn, he worked as a landscape architect, a city planner, an organizer, and later in the Obama administration's White House Domestic Policy Council. He holds a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture, a Master of Community and Regional Planning, and a Doctorate of City and Regional Planning. We have, by the way, AIA and LACES credits available for today's lecture. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Billy Fleming for today's lecture topic.
Switch this thing on. You can hear me? Amazing, okay. Well, let me just begin with a couple thank yous. One of those is, I think, maybe general and about Ball State. And I'm sure you all know this, your faculty probably tell you, and you may not believe them, but we fight every year with Harvard, UVA, Berkeley, everyone else over Ball State alums who come to our program. I feel really honored to get invited to come here and spend some time with you because I know how incredible the education that you get here is. And I have to say too, to the Whiteheads, I cannot thank you enough for bringing me here for this reason. I can't think of a better way to keep someone's life alive, keep their memory alive than this. I'll carry Ethan with me everywhere I go. And I know everybody you bring here for this lecture will the rest of their life too. So thank you for bringing me here. So with that, let me talk about Green Dreams or whatever. If anybody knows where that title comes from, you can shout it out in the questions, and I'll make sure you get one of the free books. So I'm going to do a couple things in this talk. I'm going to do a little bit of kind of framing just to kind of give you a better sense. Oh, yep, lights are important. Thank you, Dean. Just give you a better sense of kind of the bigger climate policy context as I think of it in my work. I'm going to give you a bit more then about some of that actual work. So some of the research I've led in the McHarg Center the last few years, some of the studios I've been really fortunate to lead, some of the policy work I've been really lucky to do with members of Congress and other folks around the country, around the world in some cases. And then I have a little bit of like random basketball propaganda in here since Arkansas for the first time in like 20 years is actually good at basketball again. Apologies to IU and Purdue. So it's always important to, I think, begin these kinds of conversations with a little bit of table setting. So what's the context in which questions about energy transition and climate justice and so on sort of come to the fore for people in the built environment professions and disciplines? And what you're looking at here are a set of IPCC generated scenarios, warming scenarios from the worst at the top of there, the 6.5 degrees of warming scenario, down to the most optimistic, which puts us somewhere in the 2-ish or so degrees of warming. So we're looking here, this is from Carbon Brief. You're looking at things called SSPs. These are emissions pathways, essentially, trying to give us a sense of the shape of the world under these different emission scenarios. And why this matters for design is lots of reasons. Some of those have to do with sea level rise and the different sort of effects on coastal cities under these different warming scenarios. Some of them have to do with the literal building materials we choose. But we're at a point now, if this thing works, yep. So if this is us here, this is showing you a bunch of very optimistic scenarios in which things like carbon dioxide removal technology, the giant fans essentially that can suck carbon out of the air and put it back into the ground, that's assuming those become commercially viable faster than like anyone in theoretical or practical sort of sciences suggested. What we're actually probably on, let me come back, is this pathway, somewhere in the 4 to 4.5 degrees of warming. And I'll talk more about the effects of what that mean there, but I want you to think about that number for the rest of your design career, because 4 degrees of warming means billions of people literally physically displaced because where they live is underwater. It means billions of people displaced because food systems and water systems collapse. It means billions of people displaced because heat and drought become unmanageable, not just in places that you might think of as far flung from here, but down the road in Chicago, and I'll show you a little bit more about that as well. And these, I put these up here, one, because I think they're important for table setting, but also because these are abstractions that tend to, I think, give designers a bit of an excuse to pull themselves out of questions of climate justice and the energy transition. To think about these, think about the story of climate change, planetary climate change, and our response to it as a problem of molecules and electrons. That we should understand our role in this as managing carbon emissions solely, managing the source of the electrons in our circuits, and to leave the rest of the world as we know it untouched. To essentially replace one fuel source with another and leave things as we understand them to be in place today. And it leads us, this is a map from the IPCC from several years ago, produced with partners at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, just giving you an historical record here of warming across the planet over the last century and a half. You can see, not looking great. But what these abstractions tend to do is to distract us, I think, in some ways, and here's one more abstraction for you before I get to some more grounded images and work. This is showing you basically carbon emissions moving through the Earth's atmosphere. So almost exclusively coming from the global north, very little, if any, coming from the global south. And for those of you who know the state of the climate science today, you know that the effects are least acute in the global north, the source of these emissions, most pronounced in the global south, the least contributing to those particular problems. And I say that because there's this set of interconnected planetary systems that are at issue here that we tend to think of as outside the envelope of a building, outside the boundary line of a parcel, outside the jurisdictional line of a municipality, so that we can tell ourselves focusing on a building, an object, a park, a water system, excuses us from any responsibility from engaging with these broader systems, which have massive human and non-human consequences around the world, and are part of, but distinct from, larger sort of land use transformation patterns that have been underway for centuries. You're looking here at global deforestation patterns. The red here is basically, if I can figure out the clicker, sorry. The red here is showing you extant or extinct sort of areas of forest. That's arboreal forests, some of the most important forests on the planet for refreshing carbon or treating carbon in the atmosphere. And most of those, again, are happening in parts of the global south and the Arctic. This is from a project some students and colleagues and I worked on for the last couple of years called Field Notes Towards an Internationalist Green New Deal. Lots more I could say about it, but just here on the question of deforestation. Deforestation is, in simple terms, the permanent loss of an ecosystem. It's a measure of absence and an indicator of presence, in this case of a political economic system that treats trees and nature as resources to be mined, processed, and deployed in the service of modernity, which is a trap I sometimes feel my architecture colleagues falling into when they think about, I think very earnestly and in some cases very rightly, thinking about material substitutions in the building industry. That if we simply remove our petrochemical building materials, replace them with things like CLT, that we'll have done our sort of due diligence in this question of climate justice. And as I'll talk about here in a little bit, I think that's pretty much bullshit. And so this also relates now to like questions that landscape architects and city planners also tend to engage with. You've probably heard of billion tree projects, natural climate solutions, this idea that we can tree plant, wetland restore, our way through the climate crisis to some sort of livable, luxurious future. And that sounds nice. The problem is that as we've audited all of these systems that have been piloted over the last 20 or 30 years, we find that they're actually delivering only about half of the carbon sequestration benefits that we were promised. And that half of those benefits don't get sequestered on a geologic timescale. That's a lot of light jargon to throw at you. So what I mean by that is those carbon emissions are put back either into the tree itself or into the topsoil. And the moment that tree is cut down, the moment that topsoil is disturbed, that carbon is re-released. It's not put back into a geologic container. And unfortunately, climate change moves on geologic sort of timescales. And this is connected in some ways to that international project grew out of a frustration I and others had from a previous project called an Atlas for the Green New Deal. I'll say a little bit more about this later, but this is a project that grew out of a couple of years in the early days of the McHarg Center, of myself and others convening sort of national leaders of the climate justice movement. So Varshini Prakash, who runs the Sunrise Movement, Rihanna Gunn-Wright, who runs the climate program at the Roosevelt Institute, lots of other folks who probably are familiar names to folks who know the climate world, and me simply asking them, what can we do, what can I do at a center like Penn that has a platform, has some sort of physical and social sort of capital out in the world, and some real resources to spend. What can we do to be useful to you? What are the kinds of things that a center like this can do to make your lives easier, to make your wins faster? And overwhelmingly, their response was, we just really need, these are mostly groups with kind of a federated structure, so they have local groups driving campaigns and direct actions all over the country. The response is, we just need access to the same stuff you have. Like, we don't have EDU email addresses, we can't get to the data, we can't get to the papers. We have general sort of understandings of the course level of sort of challenges we're gonna face in our respective cities as climate change exerts itself on how and where we live. But we don't have enough to like do anything at the project level or at the local level. So we began working with them to both collect and downscale and curate as much climate and built environment data as we could, and to package it into a set of images, a set of drawings, a set of maps that hopefully were charismatic enough that people would want to spend like a couple hours scrolling through 200 maps on a website, which I don't think anyone has actually done. But nevertheless has become an incredibly useful sort of project for us. The first year it was published had around 500,000 or so unique visitors and downloads. That number is around like 4 million now, and I'm always surprised to find different groups that I've never heard of or met using this thing. Some of them are familiar, like the Sunrise Movement, a youth-led climate justice organization. Some of them are not. Rural electric co-ops that are powered almost exclusively by coal or natural gas that are using this thing to think about their own energy transition. I know some of you are working through renewable energy deployment sort of questions in studio. I'm sure you'll do lots more of that. One of the things we talked about in that studio today was this idea that, for me, this belief that 30, 40 years ago, one of the sort of central challenges that landscape architects, city planners, less so for architects, took up was stormwater management. previously, and still in some cases, the domain of civil engineers. But we spent 30, 40 years training up a generation of LAs and planners to be able to work and operate in that space. That's where we are now for renewable energy. We're at the early days of figuring out where and how we fit in this massive generational project of not only building a grid that took us 180 years to build in about 20 years, but actually building one that's about 10 times larger. Because to build a renewable energy grid in the US, you can't just do the large, concentrated, high energy density facilities we get for oil and gas. You need lots of space to generate energy, lots of space to store it, lots of space to transmit it. This is just, if we were going to power the entire country with wind, which we're not going to, this is basically where and how you could do that, on and offshore. Same for solar power, right? This is very coarse level sort of solar gain data you would need to downscale to the local level if you were going to work on projects. And I do a fair amount of work in Appalachia. Doesn't pop on here as a particularly ideal place to deploy solar panels or wind turbines until you get down at the sort of project level or project scale, and can see that actually all of the mountaintop removal sites that are there that have pocked and marked that landscape for years, many of which now have prisons built atop them, are actually the best sites in pretty much all of the East Coast other than offshore to build those things, because they're flat, they get tons of exposure, and they're connected to a bunch of communities that have a really terrible energy mix. If you were going to do natural carbon sequestration, if you thought I'm going to tree plant my way through the climate crisis, this is what you would need to do. You'd have to blanket that much of the country in trees just to get anywhere close to that. Again, we're not going to do this. And I say that not like in a glib way, just like people, I say that because natural climate solutions are important. They're a very small part of, I think, what we're talking about when we talk about a response, a societal response to climate change. Most trees we plant are going to die. They're not going to sequester carbon. Anybody here spent time with Princeton's Adlinger Center report, the Net Zero America report? No. So this is like everyone's homework. This is the most important technical report for designers to read that's been released in the last 15 years. It has lots of flaws. This is a modeled sort of set of scenarios here for building out the energy transition in the US. Where do we put the generation? Where do we put the storage? Where do we put all of the transmission lines? How do we retire and decommission all of the extant, soon to be extant oil and gas facilities that populate the rest of the country? And you can see in here, that's a lot of work. We're literally asking designers, engineers, planners, and communities to build more things than have ever been built around energy in the history of this country, and to do it in about an eighth of the time it took us to build the grid we live with now. No small sort of challenge for them. Looking at sort of different wind and solar options here, and I wanted to pull just a couple of the more detailed analyses forward, because Indiana pops out on a bunch of these. And I don't know if that's, I assume this is a thing but just in case it's not. One of the biggest challenges around renewable energy deployment is not the technology, right? We have solar panels, we have wind turbines. There are other things that are less clear how we're going to develop them or deploy them at a commercial or industrial scale. But those sorts of things we know how to do really well. And Indiana is going to be one of the hotbeds in the country for the deployment of that technology. And I can't remember who I was talking about this with on the way in this morning. I think it was you. We're talking about some frustrations with the inability to get, say, a power purchase agreement in place for the university. And instead thinking about, if it were me and I were thinking about how to talk about this with a state legislature that might be hostile or just skeptical of a plan that was built around building renewable deployment capacity in and around Ball State, I would tell them this, that transition's coming. You can either take credit for it or you can get blamed for not doing it sooner. Because here on wind, here on solar, by 2030, you'll be at your peak renewable energy deployment for wind. By 2040, you'll be at it for solar. This is no longer speculative. This is the guidebook the Biden administration is using to roll out IRA and IIJA, their two big climate infrastructure bills from the last 2 years. It's going to guide the next 10 years of renewable energy deployment. And you're not going to be the most transformed state, but you're on the short list. And that's why I was particularly excited to see a planning studio working through this. This is not a topic that most of our planning studios work through at Penn. And to give you one more sort of slice of this, to look here again at sort of the proportion, the total and the proportion. So on the left here, all we're looking at are some little graphs showing you the total volume of land, the total acreage. So by state, how does that look? This is looking at the proportions, right? So again, in Indiana, you're talking about upwards of 5 to 10% of the entire state's land, of the state's land area, being set aside for just wind and solar power generation and transmission and storage. That's not getting into advanced nuclear, not getting into any other form of geothermal or renewable energy. That is just those two bits of technology. And I say that because that can be really scary. This is industrial scale technology. Humans do not have a great history of deploying industrial scale technology very well in ways that care about anything other than optimizing the efficiency of that plant. People live around it, to hell with them is typically how that goes. And I say that because there are actually lots of options. We've learned a lot over the last 50, 100 years of building, maintaining, stewarding energy infrastructure. And what we're looking at here is the largest agrivoltaics installation in the world. This is an Ningxia project in northern China. It's an agrivoltaics project, and what that means is they're combining solar energy production with food production. Lots of reasons why agrivoltaics make sense in general, not everywhere, but in general in some places. One is that the solar panels themselves actually make the food production more efficient. Easier to grow some crops in some particular context with solar panels involved. It's also, in China, part of a larger anti-desertification project. So if you know Chinese ecology particularly well, or the landscape, you know northern China is rapidly desertifying, much like sub-Saharan Africa, much like the American Southwest. Many other landscapes like this, Atacama in Chile is this way as well. And this is one of their strategies. It's not just to plant a bunch of trees to halt or slow desertification and do the thing we did for the last century, which is build things for a single purpose and hope that they work, and often they don't. But to actually build something like this for multiple reasons: for energy production, for food production, for ecological health and restoration, and for jobs. So you can see them here in some of the installation, some of the management. I'm finishing up the sort of draft of a new book called Building Post-Carbon Futures. Has a center folio of projects, 25 or so of them, that are meant to be kind of prototypes of what the kind of world that climate justice advocates would like to build. This is one of those projects. This is as well. This is the largest CDR plant in the world, the only commercially viable carbon dioxide removal plant in the world. This is in Iceland, near the Laugavur region, so kind of central South Iceland. If you don't know what carbon dioxide removal technology is, you're going to have to learn, because it's coming for all of us, for better and for worse. This is a set of very complicated, again, industrial scale technologies that basically, using giant fans and like vacuums and suction machines, attempt to capture at a very large scale as much carbon from the atmosphere as they can, funnel it into a pipe, and pump it into often kind of an abandoned well, either for oil and gas, and then to seal that well. They know how to do this because the only time we've ever used this technology successfully as a species has been for something called EOR. Who knows what that is? Enhanced oil recovery. So we've only ever used carbon dioxide removal to get more oil out of the ground. We're now trying to find ways to use that technology not to sustain the sort of fossil fuel empire that dominates much of this country, much of the world, but to sort of end the fossil fuel industry in a reasonable and a manageable and a planned way. This is happening, the US is probably at the very bottom of the list for countries that are doing this well. If we go just a little further north, this is one province in Canada. Canada is in a very unique situation. It's the imperial core of the industrial mining sort of sector. So mining companies are traded on the Canadian Stock Exchange, not in the US. Most oil and gas companies traded in the Canadian Stock Exchange, not the US. It's a resource country, and often isn't talked about that way. They're also now at this interesting inflection point at the end of the planning phase of their Truth and Reconciliation exercise with First Nations. And they're in the implementation phase. And for them, that means many things, but for the energy system, what it means is that a majority of the direct benefits of every public dollar spent on the energy system for the rest of time must go to First Nations. So these energy projects are owned 51% or more, in some cases 100%, by First Nations and tribes throughout Canada. They also get to manage and benefit from them in lots of ways that are quite interesting. But they also, again, they imply this massive scale of landscape transformation. You're looking here at one small segment of one transmission line connecting one of those plants to a city in that province. This is them sort of clear-cutting that part of the forest to do so. This is what one of those installations, this is basically a energy project town. We had company towns, 150 years ago in Levittown or so, 100 years ago in Levittown. Historians here, please don't fact check me on that date. we're now getting in parts of Canada, other parts of the world, as we begin to build out the sort of clean energy and hopefully sort of democratic infrastructure that we're going to need for an energy transition that doesn't leave a bunch of people behind. And that's just talking about like the molecules, right? Like the carbon in the air, the electrons in our circuits. That's not getting into all of the other humans and non-humans that that are actively today moving because of climate change and will continue to move. This is coming from a set of projects we worked on. I'm going to go to the next slide. A set of projects we worked on with Matthew Hauer. This is part of that Atlas for the Green New Deal project I mentioned earlier. Matt's, he's like the first climate geographer. He's maybe the first geographer to like literally make that his discipline. And part of the way he did that was to go through and literally count up the number of structures, so that will be underwater under the different sea level rise scenarios. So under the 1.5 degree of warming up to the 6 degree of warming, how many buildings will literally be underwater by the end of the century? That's a massive undercount of how many people will be on the move, because it's just how many homes will literally be uninhabitable without intervention. Not getting into all of the problems that come with sea level rise. For folks whose homes won't be constantly inundated, they'll have periodic inundation. All of their stormwater and wastewater management infrastructure will be unusable because as sea levels rise and salinity increases, it corrodes those systems. Most of them aren't able to be retrofitted at all, and if they are, it's very expensive. So Matt's getting in here and estimates about 12 million or so people on the move by the end of the century, just from sea level rise. He thinks that's about 10% of the number of people who are currently living in the country who will be on the move, so about a third of the country. That's not even getting into the number of people who will come here. So thinking about not just the energy system, but what do we do with these places that are marked for either abandonment or shrinkage, which is what many of these coastal cities you see here kind of losing people are set for. And what do we do with all the places that are not on the coast where folks are going to move? How do we prepare for that? How do we think about receiving zones in different ways? So this is him attempting to sort of model, using demographic models, where people who are displaced in these places might leave, and we were the first ones really to visualize it. That question matters a lot because most of what we're seeing at the moment around climate resilience, climate adaptation in the US is pretty bleak in terms of what kind of resources, what kind of structures we're using to facilitate it. One of the reasons you see so many people in that previous graphic moving from a place like, say, Queens to Miami-Dade, which one vulnerable place to another, is because we have no real ability to manage kind of resettlement or housing markets in this country, or we don't use them. We've chosen not to use them. And that leads to a bunch of like really splashy and cool and fun design competitions like this that yield nothing for people who actually live in these cities. Rebuild by Design, very interesting thought experiment. I think it was worth the sort of risk of taking in the aftermath of Sandy, because so much of the post-disaster recovery system in this country is broken beyond repair. But I think we can also say now, 10 years on, it was a total disaster and a failure. We're going to get one real project out of it. The Big U, the Dry Line, all the Lower East Side resiliency projects had many names, but it's essentially the large surge barrier around Lower Manhattan. It's not going to look anything like what was proposed during Rebuild by Design. The community groups who were part of that planning process during RBD have since come out in opposition to the project that the city is putting forward. The only thing that's been deployed so far are about 10% of the Living Breakwaters project that Scape and Kate Orff and others put together, wherever that is, yeah, right here. All they're going to get from that proposal are a couple of nearshore reefs, nothing else. None of the amenities, none of the onshore programming, none of the other things that were promised to those groups during that competition. This is another version of that they did in San Francisco a couple years ago. And I say that because, one, recovery through competition or adaptation through competition is never going to work in this country. That's not how people get better quality of life. It's how we pit communities against each other for scarce resources and call that justice. It's also going to wind up, I think, in a place like New York, in a place like San Francisco, where they have a surfeit of technical and political and financial capital. They're going to figure out what they're going to do to respond to climate change, with or without competitions like this, with or without studios focusing their efforts on what's going on there. And there's a reason why I don't do really any work in these places. I mostly work in Appalachia, the lower Mississippi Delta, and abroad in places like South Greenland, because those are places that are not served well by markets. And our profession, for better and for worse, is bound completely by market forces. And I say that because I think if it were me, if I were running a competition like Rebuild by Design, if I were in charge of setting studio curricula for the entire country, if you just want to make me studio czar for the day or whatever, I would never do another studio in either of these cities. I'd do them in the kinds of places where you're doing them, right? In places where the noise and the bullshit and everything else that comes with working in a big city like New York or San Francisco makes projects like this impossible. It's the reason why we're not getting what we asked for at Rebuild by Design. And the same folks who were behind it are now this is part of a larger Dutch water management neo-colonial sort of structure that they've put in place. If you don't know, the Netherlands' principal export for the rest of the century is planned to be water engineering expertise. It's not tulips anymore. What they want to do, because they've sort of exhausted their ability to do much else in terms of exporting for the country, is to make themselves into the world's climate adaptation specialists. And they've done very well at that. Sorry, my partner's calling me. And one of their plans is to move the entire city of Jakarta, 10 million or so people, by the end of 2030, I want to say, yeah, 2030. Plan to be relocated. You can see a little bit of that here. And this is happening all over the world. They're in the US, they're in Jakarta, they're in much of Europe, they're in much of Latin America, they're in parts of New Zealand and Australia. And I don't say that to disparage the Dutch, lovely people. And I work a lot with Dutch engineers around questions of climate change and adaptation. But it is a problem for a country to predicate its entire economic development strategy on exporting water management and expertise to places where it doesn't make sense. Jakarta is not Rotterdam. New Orleans is not Rotterdam. New York is not Rotterdam or Amsterdam. And despite that, they often get treated that way in these competitions and projects. Now, this is all happening as a whole bunch of other stuff is happening, right? So the EU is going through its own sort of post-COVID green recovery moment, much more so than the US. So pumping billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of euro into a COVID recovery that is tailored specifically around goals that are, you'll see, that are core to the Green New Deal here in just a moment. In the US, we're on a different path. The Biden administration has pushed us on a very, what I would call an eco-modernist sort of energy transition pathway. What I mean by that is the sort of general philosophy here is to do something I sort of warned against at the beginning of the lecture, to simply take the world as we know it today, to erase oil and gas from it, to substitute in clean energy technology and call it a success. Leave all the other things that are problems, social and otherwise, in this country untouched. And one of the things the Green New Deal has tried to do is to connect those dots for people. And when we look at what the Inflation Reduction Act is actually doing, the President's climate bill, one of the many things they're trying to do is what they would say is onshoring the clean energy transition. So we used to do all of our industrial scale mining in other parts of the world, in places far from scrutiny, far from cameras, far from media, far from anyone who could see if the companies we've sort of hitched our wagons to were doing things like, say, using enslaved labor or dumping toxic waste into communities that never knew it was there, and onshoring all of that. So when you go to Nevada and see the lithium project, the Nevada lithium project there, it's part of this core strategy to onshore as much of the energy transition to the United States as they possibly can. Some good things to that. We're going to hopefully stop strip mining places like Congo and Chile and Greenland, but creates a whole bunch of other problems for us to manage. How do we do this responsibly, knowing that while I would prefer we not do any mining to do this, we're going to have to do some. We can't just conjure solar panels and wind turbines and batteries out of thin air. We have to extract material to do that. How do we do it well? How do we avoid doing it the way we did our mining in the middle of the century around the nuclear program, almost all of which was concentrated on reservation land or in land adjacent to reservation land, sent uranium tailings and other things into a number of different sort of reservations throughout the US. And that's the biggest fear now for EJ advocates, is that's the path we're on again. And you can see it, people have begun organizing for this. It's been going on for quite some time. You're looking here at some indigenous activists in the Andean highlands in Chile, in the Atacama Desert. And this is essentially the sort of game, I don't want to call it a game board, but this is the map that we're going to be dealing with for the next 100 years around landscape transformation. These are all the active and speculative rare earth element and critical mineral mines in the world. The densest collection is right here, South Greenland, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Well, actually, I'll talk about it right now. It's just the next slide. So anybody here been to Greenland before? Okay, so if you've been to the Arctic, it's very similar in some ways. No roads between settlements, so you get from town to town via airplane, helicopter, boat, dog sled, snowmobile, or walk if you have time. They're not sovereign, so they're a protectorate of Denmark, so they're subject to Danish rule and courts. And because of that, this collection, especially here in South Greenland, is the subject of a major lawsuit by a company based in Australia, but called Greenland Minerals, which has applied for unsuccessfully several times an exploitation license to reopen a mine called the Kvanefjeld. It's a nuclear mine, or uranium mine in South Greenland. And after striking out in Greenland, they're now at the final days of suing Greenlandic people in Danish court and are probably going to win. And I think when I talk about the energy transition, I typically talk about the things that are familiar, the panels, the turbines, the batteries, and so on. Lots of other things are made out of those materials. Some of them are medical, some of them are digital infrastructure related, but there is no sort of modernity as we know it without all of these things, without all of that extraction. This thing is like full of rare earth elements and critical minerals. You could probably pull them out of there and get started on a lithium ion battery. My phone, full of them. Every piece of technology in this room, full of them. And this is part of that project, Internationalist Field Notes, in which we try to begin stitching together what it means for this thing what it means for a set of wind turbines in central Indiana, what it means to deploy those here for the rest of the world. Where do we have to take from? What kind of waste do we have to dispose elsewhere? What are all the consequences to a place like Chile, to a place like Congo, to a place like reservation land in Nevada, for us to get the energy transition that serves us well in a place like this? And this creates some challenges for us in the built environment professions because we're structured through market forces. There aren't a lot of other sort of models for practice for us in the US other than client-driven, project-based work. And so what you're looking at here, what looks like light pollution there is gross regional product. So this is a measure of wealth. It's one of the best ones we have. In purple, you're looking there at the firm headquarters for the 100 largest architecture, engineering, and landscape firms in the world. And then all of the smokes coming out from that are their publicly listed projects. And one of the things, this map isn't like a perfect 100% match, but one of the things it highlights is that we tend to go where capital flows, right? And most of the places that are at the front lines of the climate crisis, of the energy transition, are outside of those boundaries. So how do we think about ways to be useful to this movement, knowing that our practice, at least for the foreseeable future, is structured in ways that prevent us from working in those places productively, and often actually require us to damage those places. And so this is, down the road or across the road from you over in Iowa, one of my favorite architectural theorists, Doug Spencer. I think the last event I did before COVID was there with him around some of these questions. Writes about this in a phenomenal book, that while architects and architectural theorists have generally been less brazen than Patrick Schumacher about their enthusiasms for the subsumption of the urban architectural orders to those of the market, they have tended since at least the mid-1990s to push those same truths of the way of the world as have served the logic of neoliberalism. And this is in here in part to just say that, one of the pushes back that I and others often get from folks in our field when we bring up questions like this is that these are all things that are important but outside the realm of design. We make buildings, we make parks, we make public works systems. We don't worry about mining. We don't worry about all these other things. But the reality is we actually do. We just don't talk about those things. We talk about the shiny objects. We don't talk about all the other work our field does. And in this country that matters a lot for a few reasons, but one of those is that procurement rules guarantee that all of the largest federal projects will go to a handful of very large multidisciplinary firms. And those firms, while they have some interesting projects and very lovely projects in them, also have these. So this is from AECOM's Justice portfolio site. This is Pima County Prison in Arizona. They have another 30 or so prison projects like this. That's one of the firms we're going to ask to sort of lead the energy transition. HOK, another lovely firm in general, but also builds, in this case, the entire sort of oil infrastructure of the Middle East, corporate headquarters, but also pipelines, lots of other things they've built in that regard. And then in my own field in landscape architecture, Martha Schwartz Partners. Martha's been an incredible voice in our field for bringing climate back into the conversation, but it's happened as her firm has been building what have been called by climate activists in some of these places eco-apartheid projects. You're looking here at Turtle Island outside of Dubai, where you can see, I think that's Rachel McAdams drinking what is probably like a $400 glass of wine And a project built, it would be built with enslaved labor, would be incredibly high carbon, and it would do nothing other than become another playground for the rich in a city that is known as a playground for the rich. So with all of that, so this creates some challenges for us as we think about who do we trust to actually lead, project manage, build the energy transition. For me, it's not those places. So what do we do with that information? I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but I'm going to try and get there by the end of this. So let's talk about what the Green New Deal actually is as opposed to what it's mythologized to be as we start to get into that question. I think, in some cases it's been talked about as a plan to kind of end hamburgers and airplanes. Flew here on an airplane, ate a hamburger last night. Like, I don't think that's true, but people can say that if they want. The reality is that the G&D is wholly unique in the American experience, and in lots of ways. One of those is that it's the first climate plan ever put forward that actually tries to address all of the things I've kind of rambling talked about today. So decarbonization, a technological question, justice, which is a societal question, and jobs, which is an economic question. We've never had a climate plan put forward or program put forward in this country that tries to do more than two of these things at once. Often we're lucky if we get one of those things. It's also unique in that it's the only climate plan or program ever put forward that's actually indexed to the latest IPCC climate science reports. At the time it was released, was indexed to the 1.5 degree report, since been updated to AR6, the latest assessment report. The only other climate program we've ever had proposed in this country that came close to passing and would have had a very measurable impact on emissions was Waxman-Markey, the cap and trade bill in 2009 and 10 that passed the House and failed in the Senate. Even at its full implementation, so in the most optimistic modeling scenario that was generated to get people excited about the bill, it would have generated 0 jobs and taken us to 4.5 degrees of warming. And the G&D is imagined as a $12 trillion project that would create essentially 15, 20 million jobs by 2050, and take us to a 1.5 or 2 degree warming world. So again, far more ambitious in scale and scope and pace. And it's not just the kind of societal or social policy sort of program, right? It's actually quite explicitly a built environment program. Part of that is because I was in the room when some of these conversations were beginning, but also because the organizers who were behind it understand that people are never going to, and we shouldn't expect them to understand or care about climate change through like molecules in the air or electrons in their circuits. Not going to walk outside and know viscerally it's a low carbon day because I can feel it on my skin. Not going to turn this screen on in 2050 and be like, wow, this is powered by wind. I feel so much better. My quality of life is so much better. But people do understand investments in how and where they live, if they have kids, where they send them to school or to play, if they have to travel between those places, how they do that. If they recreate or have leisure time outside, the quality of those things for them. And one of the things HR 109, the sort of non-binding resolution that introduced the Green New Deal to the larger public consciousness, calls out is a plan to transform the built environment of the United States, among other things. Won't read all of these, but retrofitting every existing building in the country for maximum water and energy efficiency. Architects, you've got that covered, right? No small or no easy or no big task. You're meeting every hazmat and brownfield site in the U.S. Landscape architects, you've got that, you're good. Overhauling the entire U.S. transportation system around low or no carbon transportation modes. Planners, you're on it. Right. Any one of these would be a generational project. To see all of these captured in a single program is both really exciting and I think a gauntlet that's been thrown down that we have to answer as a set of disciplines if we care about making ourselves useful to the future of this planet and the people who are fighting for it. It's also unique as a program in actually attempting to form a multiracial, multi-class sort of coalition in support of it. And we can talk lots more about it, but it's been talked about as the New Deal 2.0 for lots of reasons. And it also, again, to think about this built environment question is not focused on abstractions like those big maps of the world that I showed you earlier. Everybody in our field loves to show those. When I think about the Bjarke-Ingels Master Planet-like proposal, which is one of the most ridiculous things I think I've ever seen. It's just a bunch of lines on a map saying, I've solved the energy transition for people, you're welcome. That's not how this is going to go, and that's not how most people will experience it. And it's now being tested and in some cases prototyped by progressive electeds in places all around the country. Michelle Wu in Boston, Helen Gim in Philly, Nithya Raman in Los Angeles, also Nikhil Saval, especially in Philadelphia. He's a state senator, he's my state senator in South Philly. And Nikhil, despite being in a state legislature that is stacked as a supermajority Republican state legislature, so they can just tell all the Democrats basically in the state ledge to piss off. They have no say, they have no power to vote on anything, because they really don't. Nikhil managed to convince them to support the most progressive weatherization assistance program in the United States. I got to work on it with him, but lots of other people did too. Daniel Adana Cohen, lots of other folks who worked on that. Steph Carlisle, an engineer, or excuse me, architect, some of you probably know, who works at the Carbon Leadership Forum at UW. And this is now happening. There are houses in my neighborhood on my block who are getting triple glazed windows, they're getting rooftop solar, they're getting all of the things that are necessary to upgrade our existing building stock through this program. And Nikhil, who is an architecture critic by training, is an avowed Marxist, somehow got our state legislature to support this thing. And if Nikhil can do that in Pennsylvania, a state legislator can do that anywhere. I know folks often think about PA as like a fairly progressive or purple state. That's true in Philadelphia. That's not true anywhere else in the state. You drive 30 minutes outside, there are more Confederate flags in Pennsylvania than there are where I grew up in Arkansas. And this is a false color image of the Bakken Formation. Anybody know the Bakken? No, this is a resource community in North Dakota. It's the single biggest natural gas hub in the U.S. When you look at light pollution maps of the U.S., this appears as maybe the only heavily populated part of North Dakota. It's not people; it's methane gas flares coming out of there as they drill. And this is coming from an article one of my friends, Thea Riofrancos, wrote. I won't go through this whole thing with you, but she's essentially charging here that there are very real risks that the idea of the Green New Deal can be captured by forces that are actually counter to some of the goals, right? That it might become a way to repackage the status quo. And that's a very real fight we're now sort of wading into, dealing with friends and not friends in the Biden administration. Now, before I talk too much more about that, let me back up in time for a moment. I know this is you can laugh at it, this is a bizarre slide. So let's talk about the New Deal, because it's not the reference I would have chosen, I think, but this is the reference Green New Dealers have chosen to think about the kind of scale, scope, and pace of transformation we're talking about here. And I always like to start that conversation with this slide, because there's like an image you probably are familiar with to the right, and then just a wild public health campaign that they put together as well around STIs and dinosaurs. You could get away with a lot back then, I guess. But let's talk about the New Deal. So, the New Deal emerges in a particular context, and it was chosen by Green New Dealers because they see analogies in the contemporary sort of moment to their moment. They had their own ecological crisis, which in the U.S. was the Dust Bowl, the collapse of Midwestern agriculture and the forced migration of about 3.5 million people from Oklahoma, Kansas, much of the Great Plains, out west, mostly to California. They had their own economic crisis. So the last time we got to 25% unemployment until COVID was the Great Depression, with literal breadlines in this country. And they also had their own political crisis with the rise of fascism in Europe, not only in Europe. And when Green New Dealers talk about this moment in time, this period of state-led transformation, they'll often say we have our own ecological crisis. It's just larger. It's planetary climate change. We have our own economic crisis. It's just larger. It's the failure of capitalism to deliver many of the benefits we were promised it could deliver in an even sort of way. And it's our own political crisis, which is the resurgence of fascism, not only abroad, but especially this time at home. And when designers talk about the New Deal, this tends to be the focus, right? The TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. Lots of reasons for this. One is that it was led by architects and landscape architects and city planners, and we love nothing if not self-mythology. So our predecessors led it must be great. Let's talk about it. But also because it did some other things quite well. It was one of the first sort of efforts to build multifunctional infrastructure in the US. So you're looking here at the Norris Dam in Tennessee, part of a larger program that takes the Tennessee Valley from 10 to 97% electrification over the course of the New Deal. Life-changing sort of anti-poverty measures in that way. But it was also designed intentionally to be a public spectacle. And this is taken from a viewing platform where you can basically park your car, pull over, and take shots of these things. You can go in. When you tour them, there's always a sort of key map on the floor to show you where you are in the larger TVA system. There's lettering on all the facilities to say built by and for the people of the United States. Very, very heavy-handed forms of communication. But the idea here was to make the public hands sort of visible in the transformation of the region. And to do something besides just build electricity generating capacity. and in that way was wildly successful. This becomes the second most visited collection of public lands after the National Mall in the post-war period from 1948 to 65 or so, and still is one of our most visited collections of public lands in the US. But focusing on the TVA for lots of reasons tends to be a bit of a distraction, I think, because the story of the New Deal is not just big heroic works of infrastructure, the TVA, the Appalachian Regional Trail, Grand Coulee Dam, although those things are cool. It's actually the 120,000 other projects, 120,000 plus projects that it gave us that were far more humble, far more quotidian. Basically every sewer system built west of the Mississippi comes to us via the New Deal. 80% of the state parks we have in this country given to us by the New Deal. 40% of the electricity transmission capacity in this country given to us by the New Deal. Almost every municipal airport in this country given to us by the New Deal. There's a much larger story here for us, and even in Indiana, which there's this wonderful resource, the Living New Deal, where you can poke at all of these different dots that are projects in and around here. But Washington Park Zoo, anybody that been there? I have not. I see a couple hands. What's your favorite animal there? Quick. Yell it out. You're whispering, would you say? Okay, great. Thank you. Tippecanoe River State Park. Anybody been there? A couple hands. Great. I'm not going to ask more questions. Bryan Hall at IU. Anybody go to IU for undergrad? Did you go in that building? Built by the New Deal. What do we have here? Hoosier Gym. Anybody been there? It's where they filmed Hoosiers, literally, or part of it anyway. I say that because also when I do versions of the talk like this, I always have some of these local projects in. And when I got to go to Arkansas to do it, where I'm from and it was my alma mater, got to find out that the football stadium was built by the New Deal, which was, a nice little treat. But also, in addition to this transformation of the built environment, it was imagined as a kind of labor strategy, right? How do we think about this not just as a way to build a beautiful public realm and a functional public realm, but to give people meaningful work that they're invested in and that makes their lives richer, better, fuller. And this is a bunch of line workers coming off a shift at the Norris Dam, the dam we just looked at in the Tennessee Valley. But when we talk about the New Deal in that way, we tend to look past its larger political strategy, which was that it had none. Often gets mythologized as this very, very heavy-handed kind of federal intervention in which FDR and his colleagues kind of project managed the country and told everyone to kind of deal with it. What it actually was just a large transfer of federal money to state and local government to figure out implementation. Very few goals, very few sort of values sort of embedded in it, which meant that it tended to reproduce whatever power structure it found on the ground. So when you go to Minneapolis, which was run by sewer socialists at this time, you see that it lengthened and strengthened their coalition. They were in power longer than they would have been without the New Deal. The same is true for Dixiecrats in the South. So the New Deal enables them to lengthen and strengthen the durability of their political coalition. This is from Brent Siebel, one of my historian colleagues at Penn, who has probably the best historiography of the TVA that exists. Writing that despite black residents constituting about 7% of the population around the dam we looked at earlier, they only qualified for about 2% of the jobs and didn't actually get most of those jobs, and that it promised improvements in quality of life for some people, but not for everyone. And we're now living through the backlash to that set of decisions. This is, political historians will tell you that the reactionary politics we all now are subjected to have their roots in the New Deal and this desire from conservatives to never let something like this happen again, in which they've been very successful. And in part, they were successful because the choices FDR and his colleagues made to ignore these questions of justice and power and elevating or diminishing certain forces in the investment program the New Deal made possible were left largely untouched. And I say again, this is for me like a big shame that the TVA has been the focus of our scholarship in our field for a long time. It's interesting, but it's not the most interesting part. And this is just landscape architecture during the New Deal. These are all the offices in the federal government where they worked. This is from Phoebe Cutler's excellent book, Public Landscapes of the New Deal. And one of the things that she sort of takes us through here is this larger story of built environment transformation. And also this idea that the New Deal itself offered a kind of soft jobs guarantee for architects, landscape architects, planners, and others whose industry collapsed during this period. Not unlike COVID, actually more like the Great Recession in 08 and 09. This was a moment of profound sort of chaos and crisis in our professions in the private sector. This is the moment when many of the public sector jobs that are now still available to you are generated or created. And they give us things like the Rural Electrification Administration. This is a map students made in the studio 4 or 5 years ago with me, just to get a sense of what the scale of the footprint of that project was during the New Deal. Among many things, it gives us 380,000 miles of transmission line. That's 42% of all the line ever built in the history of this country. We get in about 10 years via the New Deal. We spend about $18 billion in adjusted dollars on it. And we do that because FDR spent the first year of his presidency trying to get utility companies to do this and have the REA act as a lender for them and let private companies sort of do all this work. Every time they came back to him with a sort of cost estimate, it was 3, 4, 5 times higher than he thought it should be. So in year 2, he literally told them to go to hell and kicked them out of his office and staffed up the REA to do all this in-house. Unlike the TVA, which operates in an area the size of England, the REA is continental in scale, right? All 46 states at the time were working that way. The predecessor to the FAA, the Civil Aeronautics Authority, works in similar ways. Spends literally $1 trillion in adjusted funds over the course of the New Deal to build out our municipal airport infrastructure. Some of those still exist. Some of them have been converted into infill housing, like Mueller in Austin, Stapleton in Denver. These are all New Deal era projects. The lines you see there are not airports. It's because these were all built before radar was commercialized. It was only a military technology at this point. So this is when you used to navigate a plane by looking out the window and trying to find an arrow to tell you you're going the right way, or maybe a light beacon if you're at night. Midway in Chicago, anybody flown through there on Southwest? Yeah, that's a New Deal airport. LaGuardia, New York, anybody flown through there? Yeah, looks about the same from the New Deal. And now I'm going to start to wrap us up because I know we're getting close on time here. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways we've tried to sort of ask some questions about what this means for the design professions, the design disciplines in the center over the last few years. This is from an event. Anybody go to or watch this event, Designing a Green New Deal, back in 2019? I always ask because I'm always surprised there's like a random person in every school who was there or watched online. We had 1,400 people packed into this auditorium. It's an old Venturi building, if you recognize it, on campus. And our provost was very kind to come and introduce and welcome everyone to this event for us. He made what I don't think he realized was a joke when he did so, which was to say he'd never seen the room this full, not even when our former faculty member and now President Joe Biden used to do events in here. Which was great, it was hilarious, but also I think just speaks to the general appetite for this kind of work, this kind of programming, these kinds of topics and conversations on our campus, but on every campus. Everywhere I go, this is where the energy within student and faculty bodies sort of rests. And again, I mentioned this earlier, an Atlas for the Green New Deal. I won't go through this project in too much detail, except to say, one of the things we also tried to visualize here, anybody here read the book, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells? Yeah, so that book's based on this study. It's looking at, among other things, the economic effect or damages assessment that's projected for the US by the end of the century. You can see where we are here-ish. You guys are doing okay, not the worst. Where I'm from in like Southeast Arkansas, we're in trouble. My little brother who lives in Missoula, Montana, he just made way better life choices than me in general, so he's doing okay up there. But this is telling you a little bit about the kind of social, spatial, physical, economic landscape that's going to change dramatically over the rest of the century. Lots of other things we could say about that. And again, connected to this larger question of supply matrices and how do we actually think about the collection of sites where rare earth elements and critical minerals are mined, where the waste from that mining is disposed of, where the fruits of that mining are then transformed through manufacturing into bits of technology, and then where that technology is deployed out in the physical landscape, this sort of web of sites and non-sites that comprise the energy transition. And that make their way into maps like this. This is a map of mega projects from the last 30 years, so $1 billion plus projects built around the world, again with GRP as the sort of base layer, gross regional product. This is in here in part because this has been a topic of focus for philosophers the last couple of years. Olufemi Taiwo, philosopher at Georgetown, he's written like 4 books in 3 years. He's somebody I do a lot of work with, and I don't understand how he writes so much. I guess that's what like philosophy PhDs do for you. But in this really incredible book, and as you think about like other people you want to bring in for a series like this, Femi would be incredible. But wrote this book, Reconsidering Reparations, which is asking questions, at the core of that book is a question about what it means for, what does the global north owe the global south as a part of the energy transition? How do we think about the debt we've accrued in all of the ways we have transformed and imperiled that part of the planet in the name of modernity as we move forward into another sort of era? And he basically writes this as a design prompt. Injustice and oppression are global in scale. Why? Because transatlantic slavery and colonialism built the world we live in, and slavery and colonialism were unjust and oppressive. If we want reparations, we should be thinking more broadly about how to remake the world system, which is not purely a design challenge, but is a design challenge for you. And this is, one more sort of map here, or image here, of the web of connections for producing something as simple as a lithium-ion battery, the battery that's in my phone and my computer. And it's in here because, again, this question of how do we actually understand these abstractions in real physical places matters a lot. I'm not going to read this whole thing here. I'm going to get us into studio work so we can actually get some questions. But all of that context, that's a lot to throw at you, I know. All of that context, all of that research has also now been fed into a series of option studios I've been very lucky to be able to lead for about 5 years now, mostly at Penn with a short detour at Yale. In which students have been asked to sort of work through questions of priorities. How do you, in this first studio, this is the one you're looking at here, these are interdisciplinary option studios, usually always landscape architects and planners, sometimes architects, sometimes fine artists. I had a random MBA student sneak in once and don't know how that happened, and we just kept them. But ask them in that first studio to think about, how do you set priorities? How do you understand that something like a Green New Deal, something like an energy transition, isn't a thing that a single bill, a single administration, a single sort of era can accomplish? How do you give yourself enough runway to do all the things you want to do by doing the first phase or two really, really well? So who belongs at the front of the line? How would you sort of delineate places that should be the sort of first recipients of that massive investment program? And they could have chosen lots of them, but I think chose pretty well. They settled on Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, and parts of the Midwest. And then ask them in that first studio to do things that, we spend a lot of time reading. We don't draw till we're on week 5 or 6 in my studios typically. Ask them to think about how they communicate some very complex ideas like the energy transition, landed in a real place with real people in ways that anyone can understand. So one of the checks for this is I had my mom come into Zoom with us and be like, can you understand this drawing? No, we got to redo it. So this is them trying to show and communicate what the full build out of a clean energy system in a particular ridge in Appalachia would look like. You have CLT farms kind of off in the distance there. You have renewable energy technology and this weird low-tech battery called a hydroelectric battery there. It's using a former coal mine as basically a very low-tech battery. Lots of other bits of infrastructure that are in there. And also had students engaged in basically asked them, one of the things I put to them was this idea that, if the things we typically make, boards with sections and plans and axons and so on, work so well, why don't we live in a different world that looks more like those renderings and not like the world we live in today? So why don't we think about trying some other things? Why don't we experiment a little bit and find other ways to tell stories about the future, which is what design projects in studio and school are. They're speculative design projects. Why don't we lean into that spec fiction genre and think about how to tell stories about the future through people in the built environment? And this is a first attempt at a zine to do that. And the second version of that studio took students back to Appalachia and focused squarely on the coal field to prison pipeline. It's the phenomenon, if you don't know, in Appalachia, there are 2 primary uses for an abandoned coal mine. One is that it remains abandoned, maybe with some monoculture grass planted on top of it as a kind of crude form of phytoremediation. The second is that it becomes a prison. And the reasons for that are kind of threefold. They're flat, they're mountaintop removal sites, best sites to build something in Appalachia. The second is that there are state and federal grant programs specifically to build carceral facilities on abandoned mine lands there. And the third is that you don't have to remediate these sites to the same degree to put incarcerated people on them as you would for almost anything else. And so this is a part of the country which, since 1961 or so, official federal policy has been to depopulate it through divestment. So we've starved it of resources for a half century, more than a half century. Not a surprise when people there get really excited about a prison developer coming to town because it's the first form of capital investment they've had in a half century. But it obviously creates all kinds of other challenges. As we think about, and in that studio, ask students to think about how they link a sort of decarceration racial justice agenda with a climate and carbon agenda. And in this case, sort of leaning into this weird quirk of the prison system in the US that every facility has to be islanded off from the grid. It's on a microgrid. So at the moment, if you just shut, in this case, I think this is USP Letcher, McCreary, one of those prisons. If you just shut it down tomorrow, you could simply redirect the current and power a town of about 2,000, 2,500 people. And because it's on a mountaintop removal site, you could actually deploy lots of new renewable energy generation and storage capacity, and you could power the entire region of Appalachia in about 10 years if this were a sort of joint agenda in which these prisons are closed and they're repurposed as rural electric co-ops. Also had students who didn't want to focus too much on molecules and electrons and wanted to instead focus on how to democratize the design process. To say that people in these places have long held visions for the future that are far more radical and interesting than anything I can think of in a 15-week studio. So why don't I hand the tools of design over to them through a series of exercises and workbooks like you see here. And then in the third version of this studio, and I promise I'm starting to wrap up, is in the Mississippi Delta, in which we went through and began pulling archival data to geolocate historical sugar and cotton plantations that were converted into either carceral or oil and gas facilities. The oil and gas stuff is like not a complicated story, it's just what happens to much of that part of the country. The carceral facilities tend to be that the owner of a very large plantation post-emancipation couldn't make it work financially anymore, so sold it to the state for a very heavy or very hefty sum, and then became the warden until they died. So Angola Farm here, and Parchman, which is off the map, Louisiana, Mississippi State Penitentiaries, largest prisons in the world, ever built in human history, the cruelest prisons ever built and operated in human history, centers of massive convict leasing labor still today. And that's one of the sort of first exercises we did in the studio, was to begin pulling convict leasing records and geolocating them. This is a town called Thibodeau. It's where Lafourche Correctional Institute is located. Lafourche is a juvenile sort of correctional institute where basically every sandbag you might use at your house to like keep water out in New Orleans when a storm comes in, this is where they're made by incarcerated people. They also build and maintain almost all the oil and gas infrastructure, among other things, of Louisiana. And ask students to move through some exercises in which they take conventional drawing techniques, like a sort of layer cake or geologic drawing like this, or an axon, and apply it to policy questions. So what's the subsidy regime that makes this system possible? Direct, indirect, and other kind of operational subsidies. And to think about that as their starting point. So in this case, working with, I don't know, $800 million a year in like play money for doing some built environment energy transition stuff leads to like very wild projects like this, in which we have this collection of clean energy technology, dirigible transportation systems, something like Red Rocks Amphitheater, but in like a coal seam, so Black Rock Amphitheater. But thinking about ways to transform the minelands of Appalachia in ways that lower carbon, offer luxurious public amenities, and give people things to sort of celebrate, and not to think about the energy transition as something that requires us to give up the things we love about our life, but to get more of them. And that brought me now to like the fourth version of this, which I just finished in Greenland with a bunch of Yale architecture students. That's who's in the foreground there with me kind of lurking in the back. One of my students almost ate it there. So this is us in a town called Qeqertosseraq in Greenland. Every town has its own standalone hydroelectric plant. So this town that we were staying in, Narsaq, which is about 1,500 people, has its own full-scale hydroelectric plant, like the size of the one you would see in the TVA system. It's operated by one man. His name is Otto. He gets resupplied once a year. That's when he sees people, unless someone like us comes to visit him, which we did. We were the, second group he'd seen in 18 months at that point. That's his dog, which killed like 3 Arctic rabbits when we were there. It's built by Icelandic engineers, all these things then handed over to Greenlandic operators. This is here for lots of reasons, but one is this is part of their own energy transition plan. When you go to the Arctic, you can't do things like be vegan because there aren't the food sort of systems in place to do those sorts of things. But you find really quickly that actually like sustainability there looks very different than it does in a place like Muncie, in a place like Philadelphia, in a place like Dallas. There are very different challenges and questions there. And for them, part of that has been moving off of diesel power plants that used to power all of these towns into just hydro plants. Lots of other things they're doing, but that's one of them. And this is the town we stayed in. This is Narsaq in South Greenland. This is the hub of sort of commerce for the region. It's located in the footprint or in the tailwaters of the Kvanefjeld mine I mentioned earlier. This is the mine that was central to the US and European nuclear programs at the 60s and 70s, decommissioned in the 90s as a group called Uranium-Namik, a group of Inuit activists, which Uranium-Namik stands for Uranium No Thanks. Spent about 2 decades organizing to finally close this mine. They were successful in about 1991, 92. It's now been proposed for reopening to basically turn Greenland into a critical minerals, rare earth elements hub for the rest of the world to strip mine to the bones. And like the rest of the Arctic, there are roads within the city, but nothing connects it to the rest of the country. It's completely islanded off like every other community there. This is us kind of walking through. So one of the first things we did there was hike from our hotel to the mine, which is about a 6-mile hike. It was like 3,000 feet of elevation gain, something like that. I was lucky I had very game students to do that in the sort of aftermath of Hurricane Fiona, so we got rained on for the entire week we were there. Although the student in the front there, Grace, lost her phone on this hike. Sorry to Grace. I was hoping I could see it like somewhere in this photo, but I can't. Everything there also is just very visceral and real and impossible. You know, when we think about the water system of the US, incredibly abstract. When I turn on a faucet, I have no idea where that water is coming from. I don't even really care. It's part of the reason why we use water as wastefully as we do. In Greenland, this is it. Coming off that mountain, that's the water. Behind that mountain are the tailings for the uranium mine. That's the reservoir it goes into. That's the pipe it goes into. That's one of the intakes. And all of that is basically the water you drink when you're in Narsuk. And like I said, we're there as Hurricane Fiona is kind of rushing across the country. This is a creek that was about 3 feet wide. The first time I was there, it was impassable. The last time we were there, essentially, so we had to do a little kind of makeshift hike around it or through it. But one of the most important things we wanted to do while we were there was to just gather some really basic scientific data. So because they're being sued, the country, Greenlanders and Narsuk, are being sued in Danish court by Greenland Minerals, which is a very sophisticated, well-funded, multinational mining company. They have access to tons of technical data and information that Greenlanders don't. There are no Geiger counters in South Greenland. We brought the first 2 there and left them. There are no technical reports on actual radiation there. I thought there were, but when we met with the Iranian activists there, we found out that the way that they try to estimate ambient radiation is to look at ambient radiation in other contexts around the world and just like do a quick little transitive property thing for themselves. So we were measuring this as we went. The combination of mine tailings and waste and the fact that Greenland has the oldest exposed rocks in the world. So these are 4.5 billion year old rocks. They're highly radioactive. Ambient radiation on much of the hike was higher than you'd expect to find in Fukushima. And basically that's the extant sort of mining equipment there outside of town. This is us at the tail end of our quick little journey to Kulatosarok, where the hydro plant is located. But part of the reason we went there was to think through what some alternatives might be. So how do we think about not just stopping industrial scale mining in Greenland, which we should do, but how do we think about developing and offering alternatives to that not only don't strip mine the country to the bedrock, but also offer all kinds of other possible futures that a mining-based economy or resource-based economy wouldn't. And we're going back in the fall now to do some quick little design build work that hopefully leads to larger things, in which we're going to build some hoop houses and greenhouses for food production purposes. We're going to do a little bit of Arduino machine made Geiger counters for rooftop installation and field testing for folks so they can actually build up a technical case for winning their fight against the mining company in Danish court. They'll have enough data to do that, we hope. And then eventually to come back and work on something called glacial rock flour harvesting. This is, glacial rock flour is the powder that comes out at the bottom of an ice sheet or a glacier in the moraine. When you look at like an aerial view and you see like a little brown like plume at the end of an ice sheet, it's that really rich glacial rock flour. It's the most nutrient dense soil on the earth. It's incredibly valuable. It's going to be captured and sold at an industrial scale soon, and we're trying to work through ways to ensure that Greenlanders own that material, that it's not another sort of product the Danes get to take from them. And then to wrap up, which I promise I am actually doing now, the Dean mentioned one of the groups I'm very lucky to have helped start and get to work with, called the Climate and Community Project. Among many other things, this group is kind of imagined as filling a space between the climate justice movement with a very radical but often abstract set of demands that are the only demands that are actually sized to the scale of the crisis we're facing, with progressive legislators who have a real desire to work on those issues but don't have the staff capacity. If any of you have worked with members of Congress, you know they do not have enough people in-house to like even answer emails, let alone proactively work on most of the things they want to work on. So we get asked often to generate the sort of scientific or technical case for, in this case, something like doing the least amount of mining possible to build out the electric vehicle fleet we're going to need for the energy transition. If you haven't seen, this report's been, I can't believe how many legs this report has had. It's been in the New York Times 3 times since it's come out in about a month. It's been covered in every major outlet you could possibly imagine. Our lead author, Thierry Francos, was just on CNN today talking about it. It's been an incredible sort of intervention in this conversation in which the way electric vehicles have typically been thought of in this country is just a one-to-one substitution problem. How do we replace internal combustion engine vehicles with electric vehicles? So how do we get, I don't know, 270 million vehicles that run on gas to run on electricity? Without acknowledging the fact that cars are the deadliest piece of technology humanity has ever invented. So this is a plan basically to think through ways that we minimize that and invest more in public transportation. Also been really lucky through this work, through this group, to get to work on some of the most ambitious sort of federal policy proposals that have been put forward in my entire life, maybe in the last half century of the environmental movement in the US, since we got NEPA and all of the other things that the 60s and 70s gave us. One of those was a Green New Deal for public housing, which was brought to us by a group called People's Action and the Homes Guarantee. This is a group with hubs all around the country, led by public housing residents and tenants and organizers, headquartered in Kansas City, but they have offices all over the place. One of the things they brought to us was that, we recognize the G&D matters a lot, but by the way, we have this incredible and shameful backlog of deferred maintenance in all of our public housing in the US, full of, insect infestation, lead, asbestos, maybe like a gas range, not an induction stove. So how do we think about combining these things? How do we think about clearing that backlog and putting these units at the front of the line for receiving the most benefits first of the energy transition? Very excited that actually, in here we call for about 120 billion or so in investments that would clear that entire backlog and do exactly that, give the most technologically advanced deep energy retrofits you can give a building would have gone to them at that price. We got about half of that in the President's Inflation Reduction Act, so that work is starting now. Some of it's funneling into Nikhil's program in Pennsylvania. We got to announce it, so my collaborator, Dana Aldana-Cohen, and I are like right here, just off camera, but got to hug Bernie and AOC, that was great. And also led to a bunch of legislation coming out. So you see there's other stuff for transportation. We've done work on public schools with Jamal Bowman as well. There's lots of other things like this in the pipeline, and feel really lucky that we've been able to work on it the last couple of years. This is the incredible collection of people. I won't go through the full list here. You could just look at this slide and for the next 20 years, just invite one of these people to give this talk. They'd all be great. The one person, Shalonda Baker here, is off limits for a little while. She's in the Biden administration. She runs the J40 program, the Justice 40 program. So this is the commitment for the Biden administration to ensure that 40% of the benefits of all federal money spent on the energy transition go towards frontline communities. She's going to do that for probably another year, and then she'll be free to do this kind of stuff again. And just to finally wrap us up here, just to give you, I feel weird being a landscape architect who's shown you very few maps in this presentation, which is the thing I think I'm supposed to do. So this is trying to kind of help you just make sense of where all these things are happening that I've been talking about. So this is the field work site I am in for much of the Appalachian work. This is the field work site for me, which is very large, obviously, for much of the Mississippi Delta work. Those little, plus signs, that's where I grew up, Fort Smith, Arkansas. That's where I went to college, UT Austin. That's where I live now. Or that's where I live now. That's where I worked in DC. And also, to connect that to some of these rare earth frontier questions I mentioned earlier. These are the places, these are the belts of resources that matter the most to us at the moment. Stretching from the US-Mexico borderlands up past Vancouver, up into the Bakken, which is not just tar sands and oil and gas, but also lots of rare earths and critical minerals, and then extending across over here up to Greenland. These are all the sites that, for me, for all the things I've been talking about that matter the most. These are the places I'm going to spend the next 10, 20, 30 years of my career, and I hope some of you come with me. And then just because we're in Indiana, I know you all love basketball. Arkansas, I'm from Arkansas. We've been in the wilderness for so long. We went 20 years after Nolan Richardson just being terrible. 2 years in the Elite Eight, third year back in the Sweet 16. I know you don't have a team left, so if you want to root for the Hogs, I'm not going to stop you. Eric Musselman, our tiny coach, he's 5'6" and strips after every win. So you watch him on TV, he'll be shirtless if we win on next weekend. The last thing I'll say, and these are the last two slides, and then I promise I'm done, is just to crib here from Naomi Klein, who you probably know the name. Naomi is maybe the most generous person I've ever met. She used to be on faculty at Rutgers. I got a chance to spend a lot of time with her as a result. She wrote the foreword for my Friends Here book and has done lots of other things for me. But I say that because I think she both has been underappreciated and incredibly validated the last 5 to 10 years. And writing about the Green New Deal, she writes this: "The interplay between lofty dreams and earthly victories has always been at the heart of moments of deep progressive transformation. In the US, the breakthroughs won for workers and their families after the Civil War and during the Great Depression, as well as civil rights and the environment in the 60s and 70s, were not just responses to crises demanded from below, they were also the products of dreams of very different kinds of societies. Dreams invariably dismissed as impossible and impractical at the time. What set these moments apart was not the presence of crises, of which we have no shortage, but that they were times of rupture, when the utopian imagination was unleashed. And she goes on to say, and the things that appeared impractical suddenly became inevitable. And that's where we're headed now. And I just want to thank you again for bringing me here, for spending so much time with me, for giving me such a lovely experience in Muncie. And I'll stop chatting there and looking forward to your questions. Get it? No?
So what we like to do is do an informal Q&A in the gallery. If there are one or two overriding questions that somebody'd like to ask at this moment, we can take those, and then we'll move over into the reception area. Any questions come to mind? So, Andrea, do you want to bring up? So we said we give away some of Billy's books, and we have them here. So I want to have him.
What's the lottery system here?
You pull and state.
Oh, amazing.
How many?
You start.
Okay.
7.
Okay.
Lucky 7.
Is that Kaylee? Is that Kaylee?
Kaylee Taylor.
Kaylee Taylor, are you here? No. Oh.
Pull another.
Okay.
Hey, jump.
Oh, she's up there. Oh,
Okay,
okay.
we're
we
holding
got
it
we
for
got
you.
yours here. Here, I'll put it over with her name tag.
Get it signed if you come down.
Ryan Roofer. Oh, hello. All the people in the back.
He's won one before, actually. Okay, keep going.
Okay. Graham Loneker. Yeah, right. Come collect it. Hello. Wait, let me pull these out so I remember how many we're doing here. Kaylee Timmons. Molly Hoddington. Oh. Ryan Kamita. Did I pronounce that right? Kamita? Is that right? Is that Ryan? Oh, okay.
There we go.
You also have to make like some sound so I know you're walking up here. Everyone's so quiet.
It's me, it's me. Whoop, careful.
Mona Hamad.
And that does it.
I'm glad you stopped me. I was just going to keep drawing. I wasn't paying attention.
There's always Amazon where we could order some already. So if you all want to stick around for a minute, I'm sure Billy would sign it for you, and then we'll move over into the other room. So thank you again for coming.
Thanks for having me.